Bill, when did you first encounter Stoicism?
I first encountered Stoicism in a logic class in college. This would be in the early 1970s, because it turns out the Stoics were the experts in what is known as propositional logic, which is the kind of logic that makes computers and your cell phone and all these other wonderful things work. They didn't invent those things, but they came up with the logic of, and, if, or, and so on, which is now commonly used. That was the beginning. And I had heard that the Stoics did other things as well, but I didn't know what those other things were until the early, in the 2000s, when I was doing research on a book on philosophies of life. And I encountered them again, and I looked a bit deeper, and I realized that they had come up with all of these really wonderful strategies for dealing with the problems that arise in life. So as a 50-year-old, I encountered the Stoics again, and this time they had a real impact on my life.
When you learned about Stoicism for the first time, or when you kind of developed it as a reference point, was there anyone who had previously appeared in your life who you're thinking, oh, I've seen this before, I've seen this exemplified by this person?
Not really, although I realize now in retrospect that I was what I call a congenital Stoic, and that is the things the Stoics were teaching I kind of had figured out. And since then, I've encountered other people who seem to fall in that category. I get emails from people who say, well, I've been doing this all my life. You're just giving fancy names for the stuff that I've been doing. So it's an interesting thing. I was influenced going into college by people who were pushing a philosophy of life. Henry David Thoreau was a big influence. And I imagined that if I took philosophy courses, that it would cover that sort of thing. And was a little bit dismayed to realize that for them, it was just this technical undertaking where you had these arguments that had been going on for 2,000 years, but this feeling that, oh, we're almost there and we're going to figure out how to settle these arguments once and for all. And if you told a professor, as I did, well, why don't we do stuff like Henry David Thoreau did? And I was told that wasn't the proper business of a philosopher, at least not in an American university.
So what do you consider the proper business of a philosopher?
I consider, well, here's the interesting thing, because I write books for a broad general audience. So I regard the books I write as a form of teaching. So it's not teaching a classroom of college students, it's the world at large. And so I do have colleagues who stick to the narrow academic study of Stoicism. And I don't know what they think of what I'm doing, but I know what I think of what they're doing, and I know what the ancient Stoics would think of what they're doing, that the Stoics didn't develop Stoicism so academics could discuss it and write papers about it. They wrote it to help people live their lives. And so in the books I write, I'm trying to share that. And I think I'm doing Stoicism the way the Stoics would want it done.
I think that's what drew me to Stoicism originally. You have all these, I suppose, academic philosophies that are kind of attractive in one way, especially if one of those things that you want to do is prove yourself to other people and appear smart.
Yes,
and then you have the very applicable, very simple philosophy of Stoicism. And the first person to introduce me to it, I suppose, and a lot of other people, was Tim Ferriss, and his discussion of how it essentially prevented him from committing suicide. And then who was next? Ryan Holiday's work was instrumental in this. And all of a sudden I had a framework to live my life by. And I found that far more useful than anything else that was presented to me.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because, scholars, academics who do philosophy, for them, it's just a chance to show off how clever they are. And it doesn't spill over. I have this one talk I've given that if You know what? If the garbage men, if the trash collectors went on strike, we would know about it. We would care very much. If the philosophers went on strike, we wouldn't know about it. You know, you might pick up the newspaper and say, philosophers strike in its 10th year. And we would say, what? What is this? Who are these people? What are they striking about? And, you know, it hasn't had any impact on me. So I attempt to do philosophy in a way that will reach other people and will affect the way they live their lives. So for me, it's a very personal kind of thing. It's a mission. I also developed this way of thinking as a result of reading the Roman Stoics, and you know, in particular, if you read somebody like Marcus Aurelius, you come away with this notion of a Stoic social duty. Once you've got this package of useful strategies, to share them with the world, because the world is spinning its wheels. You know, it's on what psychologists call a hedonic treadmill, and that's unfortunate, because there is a way off the treadmill. There is a way to proceed. There are actually many different paths that have been described as philosophies of life. Stoicism offers one that has the advantage of in just a matter of days, you can learn enough about it that you can try the techniques out on your own, and you'll find out. You'll get very quick feedback over whether it's making a difference in your life or not. And you don't have to shave your head. You don't have to go away into the desert for 40 days or whatever. You can do it in the comfort of your own home. And no one needs to be any the wiser, you know? So you have some buddy of yours saying, weren't you a Stoic last week? What are you now? They don't even need to know. But if you do switch, they might detect a change in your attitude, in the way you're working your way through life. They might sort of realize, you know, you're not as angry as you used to be. You're not as anxious. Are you on medication? No, it's much better than that. I'm a Stoic now.
And that applicability, that ease of, I suppose, access to it and the ability to recall it is one of the reasons why it becomes such a useful tool for athletes to develop of all types as well. How do you see this as a useful tool for athletes to apply to their training, to competition, to recovery, to the way they live their lives?
So there's a few different ways you can approach that. One of when I talk about Stoicism, the Greeks were there first. The Greeks were there in 300 BC. And unfortunately, we have almost none of their writings. We have writings about what they wrote about, but not the actual writings. Fortunately, the philosophy found its way to Rome. And so when you talk about Stoicism, you're talking typically about Roman Stoicism. Four great Roman Stoics: Marcus Aurelius, that people have heard of, Seneca, Epictetus, and then the fourth, less known but wonderful Stoic, is Musonius Rufus. Epictetus's great insight, and it doesn't sound like much when you say it, and you think, well, this is an insight anybody could have had. Well, yeah, but he took this insight and he ran with it. And the insight is, there are things you can control and there are things you can't control. And if you spend your time worrying about the things you can't control, you're wasting your time. You should instead focus that energy on things you can control. So in terms of athletic training and competition, you've got that same dichotomy at work. So you can spend your training time obsessing over things you can't control, like, well, what strategy is the other person going to use? What if the other person does this or that? And you could spend your time thinking about that. You might have some degree of control over that, but you have an incredible amount of control over how you train, over which days you train, how long you train, the times you train, what you do when you're training, and when the competition approaches. You can't control what strategy they're going to use in their race, but you can control the strategy. You have exquisite control over the strategy you use in your race. So that's where you should focus your attention. I'm a rower, more precisely a sculler. So I have two oars. I don't paddle, I row. So there's an important difference in my, you can do it in any number. You can do it with one person, two people, four people, eight people. And I like a single because I have no one else to blame. And if I do well, I get all the credit, it's indisputable. But the thing is, when you're out on the water in a race, you've got to be focused. And if you start thinking about what the other rowers are doing, it's probably going to have disastrous consequences. So there's this saying, keep your head in the boat. And that means think about what you're doing. Don't think about what they're doing. They can't. You can't change what they're doing. What can you do? You can cover the distance in the least amount of time possible. And so that's what you set about doing. And if you win, hey, great. And if you don't win, well, you did the best you could. What else could you have done, right? And so you can walk away with your head high saying, I gave it my best. So it's a different approach. That whole notion of success and failure that some athletes have. What is success? Well, you took first place. What is failure? Well, you didn't take first place. Or depending, on how serious you are, success might be I didn't take last place. So for some people, that's a big deal. But there is another success, and it's internal success. And that is the knowledge that you did what you could with what you had, that you left nothing behind, you put it all out. And because that's the part you have control over. So, people who beat themselves up because the other people were better, well, if you did your best, that's just how it went. Maybe you should try a different sport or try different training techniques or try whatever. So there's this notion of what really is success, what really is failure. And sometimes when I have been a rowing coach and have talked to people into racing, people who had just learned how to row, talk them into racing, and they would go out and they would take a last place, and then they'd come back and with this look on their face, well, I came in last. And I said, actually not. Well, what do you mean? Well, number one, there were people who didn't even make it to the starting line, right? You beat them. Oh, and there were approximately 7+ billion people who didn't even sign up for the race. And many of them didn't do that because they fear failure, and you didn't. So bravo to you, that you had the courage to do that. If you get deep into a sport, you become an extreme outlier in the world, because I know I have friends who don't like to do things that involve athletic. Well, if you're doing interval training, it's no fun. It's very difficult. And so from their point of view, you're just a crazy person, right? But from your point of view, well, actually, there are rewards to be reaped, even if you don't take first place. There's self-control. There's you dealing with your inner demons. There's a bunch of other things going on.
Yeah, well, competing and being an athlete of any caliber is such a vulnerable, exposed thing to do, because on one level you are ranking yourself amongst everyone else who's competing. Yep. And like you said, you're encountering those limits, and you're really encountering the darkest part of you, or the kind of the weakest part of you, maybe the part of you refer to it as lazy Bill, which yes, I really enjoy. But you, throughout the book, or throughout the Stoic Challenge, you repeatedly refer to this as a test of character, not ability. And when we find that when you focus on the outcome over and over again, it's almost like a short-term game. It's, yes, it applies to training and maybe competition. But what about when you stop training and competing and move on to something else? What about if you get injured and you have to move on to something else? The test of character applies throughout every domain, whereas the test of ability, of physical ability, applies just within that domain. So it's a broadly applicable toolkit as well.
If you're an athlete and an athlete in training, what you do can and should spill over into the rest of your life. You're trying to do something that's very difficult to do. If it were easy to do, everybody takes away first place, so that's semi-meaningless unless you've just got ego issues. But it should spill over into other areas of your life. One thing is a kind of courage that you'll take away, of knowing you did something very hard, knowing it was hard, and you did it anyway. There are very many people who, once they realize that doing something's going to be hard, they just say, well, no, I'm not going to do that. It's hard. And that whole notion of the fear of failure, the fear of public humiliation, if you fail, and as we saw in the previous little bit of the conversation here, well, there's different ways to measure failure. And if you're like a single sculler like I am, what is failure? Well, I didn't win gold in the Olympics, right? So that counts as failure, in which case, boy, there's a lot of failure. That's one way of measuring it, but there are other ways of measuring it. Another way in which the training you do in sports spills over into the other aspects of your life. There is this notion, and I spent a few chapters discussing it in the book, The Stoic Challenge, and I talk about Stoic training. So what are you doing in Stoic training? Are you building up your aerobic capacity? Are you doing, well, you're actually doing that, but there's a bigger project there, and that is to expand your comfort zone. So your comfort zone means what? Can you do things that are going to make you uncomfortable? Do them anyway. And most people, again, will say, well, what's the point of that? Why be uncomfortable when you can be comfortable? And you look around and you see them, lying on the couch watching a football game or something else, and they're comfortable. The problem is that they have a very narrow comfort zone. So things have to be just about right for them to feel comfortable. If you have spent your mornings doing interval training, if you spent your mornings in the snow doing interval training on a river, and you come back in, you know what? Nothing you do that day is going to be like that. And by experiencing that discomfort, you come away with this sense of, I can handle this stuff life throws at me. Whereas somebody who's just always sheltered would have trouble handling that. Interval training. So one of the things we do, our races this is for masters racing. So I'm old, so I count as a masters racer. But for young people, the typical sprint would be 2,000 meters. But for us, they kindly reduce it to 1,000 meters. And if you're really, really fast, you can do it in 4 minutes in a boat. If you're on an erg, one of these rowing machines, you can do it in 4 minutes. But so I've entered regattas, dry land regattas, where we just do these erg machines. And I tell people about it, and I describe it as the 4-minute flu, because before you race, you're feeling perfectly good. You warmed up, you're feeling good, and the race starts, and 4 minutes later, you might as well have a serious, maybe nearly fatal case of the flu, because you're panting, you're dizzy, you're sweating, and then the interesting thing is, give yourself a few minutes to recover, and you'll be back. The whole thing about, now I haven't done sports like football, like basketball, the kind of team sports. So most of my sports are simply aerobic output. And I tried strength sports like wrestling back in high school. I was the worst. I was absolutely the worst, but I seem to have some aerobic capacity. So the interesting thing is, you train for that and you get better, you get measurably better. And it spills over. A sense of you can walk away competent. You can say, I've experienced challenges, it's kind of artificial challenges that I brought on by the sorts of things I do. And that competence will serve you in other areas of your life. When you hit a difficult challenge somewhere else, you'll say, well, you know what, I can row a racing scull. So this is not as hard as that, and I could do that. So this is pretty good. I don't recommend that anybody in your listening audience climb Mount Everest. There's like a 1 in 6 chance you're going to die, and you might lose some toes and everything else. But I'll tell you what, if you did climb Mount Everest, and then later on somebody presented you a challenge, you would have this in your back pocket. You'd have the knowledge that you had climbed Mount Everest. And so you could say, you wouldn't have to say this out loud, but you could think this, well, I climbed Mount Everest, so I'm guessing I could meet this other challenge as well.
Yeah, it's a perplexing thing. It's although hardly surprising and incredibly obvious that doing difficult things makes your life easier as a whole, as an average. The approach that I took for a long time was, well, through some exceptionally difficult military training, I did some very difficult things. And that created this lens of, oh, I do difficult things now. This is who I am. And it worked for a long time. And then what eventually happened after 5-6 years is I'd stopped doing as difficult things. And I needed to reintroduce myself to that hardship. So how do you, obviously those big events are very important, the competitions or the challenges that you've set out or the adventures that you've kind of laid out as major objectives. How are you doing this on a daily basis? You mentioned your training. Is there anything else that you're doing to embrace hardship?
Well, things that are difficult and challenging to do, so they come in different levels. Let me also add one thing to the interval training. The things that are really hard. How hard they're supposed to be. So in a 1,000-meter race, that 500 meters in, you're going to feel awful. But that's good, because that's how it's supposed to feel, because you've done it before. 800 meters, what it's supposed to feel like, and that's reassuring. So one of my activities, I'm still teaching classes, but one of my, I've been a writer now for 2+ decades. And if you do it, it's hard to do. It's hard to do. You sit down, you face an empty screen, and you've got to fill it with words in a very careful way. And I've learned through doing it, it's difficult to do. But then you realize, it's supposed to feel this way. So I'll have a morning where I struggle to put things down, maybe generate 400 words of stuff that's worthwhile. And then the next day I'll look at it and I'll throw it away. And if you haven't had the experience, you'll say, this means I'm not a writer. If you've had the experience, you'll know, no, this is what's supposed to happen. This is part of the process, because when I rewrite it today, it's going to be better than what I did yesterday. So that whole notion of when things feel uncomfortable, of knowing how they're supposed to feel, and then just saying this is part of the process. You mentioned, well, here's another aspect of this. So I started rowing when I was like 52. So I was an athlete in high school, took a long time off, through college, did basically nothing. In graduate school, started doing distance running, and then had kids and then stopped. And then after 10 years of that, decided to get into shape again. Did swimming, did tennis. But I'll tell you what, you talk about earlier, you talked about people who are athletes and then have some kind of injury and have to cut back. Well, the aging process is itself a kind of a creeping injury. And I compare the times I get on various things now to the times I was getting 20 years ago. And it's sad. And you can look up on charts, and it tells you, here's how much slower you're going to be a year from now. than you are today. And so it's something that needs, you need to adjust to it. I've reached a stage now, so I'm going to turn 70 next year, but I've reached a stage where every minute I spend training requires a subsequent minute of napping. And it isn't, it's not a voluntary thing. It's not like, you know, I feel like maybe I'll take a nap now. It's sort of like mandatory, where your body says it's nap time. And if you fight back, it says, okay, well, your eyes are closing now, so I hope you're not driving a car because it's nap time now. I just didn't imagine that that was coming. I have a friend who's a very, very good rower, 10 years older than I am. And you realize at that end of the age spectrum, if you're still out there on the water doing interval training, I mean, I bow down to you, because I know that must be incredibly difficult to do.
There's a piece in the Stoic Challenge, actually the whole framing of the Stoic Challenge is your book, and the way it's kind of set up, it really clicked with me. And I think the part of it that clicked in a way that much of the other Stoicism that I've read or commentaries on Stoicism hasn't clicked until now. And I think the reason why is it's such a psychological trick to view it as a challenge. It's
Yes.
really clever, wise way to do it, to get, oh, this is a gauntlet that's being thrown down to me. This is an obstacle, like in an obstacle race, or a kind of something that's standing in my way, and an opportunity to win, and an opportunity to test myself in this moment. And the way that applies especially well is in setbacks and those things that set us back, as you talk about. Can you describe a little bit about setbacks and how we can, I suppose, the two challenges in overcoming them?
Yeah, so setbacks are a constant thing in life, and some of them are trivial things. You go to brush your teeth and you realize you're out of toothpaste. That's a setback. Some of them are middle-sized. You go to drive to work or whatever, and your car is out of gas. That's a setback. And they're bigger still. You get a phone call from your doctor, and he says, you know, those tests you did last week, well, you need to come in and see me. We've got to talk. That's a bigger setback. So there's a whole range of setbacks. One Stoic insight, and this would be Seneca, primarily, who really thought carefully about this. One Stoic insight was that when we have one of these setbacks, what does us the most harm is not the setback itself, but our emotional response to the setback. So I like to use a plumbing analogy. So if you have a house and you develop a burst pipe in your house and water is flowing out, well, that's a setback. That's a problem. And it's going to cause you trouble. You know, if it goes long enough, and you're on second story, the ceiling will collapse, you know, and you'll have flooding, you'll have all of this other stuff. But, you know, it isn't the broken pipe that's the problem that's causing you the trouble. It's the water that's flooding. That's it. If all that happened was that the pipe broke and there was no flooding, it would be an inconvenience. But the flooding, same is true of setbacks in life. So if you look at the things that set you back, they tend to be little things, and what tends to magnify them, maybe at an exponential rate, is your response to them. So you're driving your car and somebody cuts you off in traffic. No collision, nothing else. So, you know, no damage done. But it can, if it makes you angry, then you've just, what could have been a good day is now taken a turn for the worse. And that anger can lurk within you. So Seneca's insight was, what we need to do is develop our ability when life presents us with a setback to bounce back, not to take it personally, but to bounce back in the following sense. So you play this game. It's the setback game, and you imagine that it's a game. And to win the game, you got to do two things. First is you've got to come up with a a workaround for the setback, some way of dealing with it. And second, you have to keep your cool while doing that. The second thing is often harder than the first. But oh, by the way, if you do keep your cool, it'll actually make it easier for you to come up with a brilliant solution to the setback. So, so this happens in life. It happens in athletic competitions. So you're doing something, and an unexpected setback happens. Your oar pops out of the oar lock. You know, there are all sorts of things that can happen. And then usually that'll slow you down. But what will really slow you down is if you panic in response, or if you get all angry in response, or if you get upset in response. That's what does you most of the harm. So the Stoic challenge, when life sets you back, when an athletic competition, when you're set back in that, what you do is you imagine that it's a kind of test. And a test that to pass it, you have to overcome it, and you have to keep your cool while you do. Raising the question of who's the tester, who's doing this? And so as a psychological device, I like to imagine that it's these Stoic gods whose job it is, right, to prevent us from getting fat and complacent. So what they do is in our life, they present us with these challenges, and then we have to respond to the challenges. Why would they do that? Are they evil? No, they're like good coaches. And I suspect that most of your listeners have encountered coaches, and they know some are good and some are bad. A bad coach is a coach who says, oh, you're just wonderful, just the way you are. Why not go sit for a while? You look like you're getting hot, right? That's not a good coach, at least not if you want to compete successfully. A good coach is going to use any number of psychological devices to find and exploit every ounce of competitive ability that is in you. And a good coach is going to push you harder than you imagined you could be pushed. Not too hard, but harder than you can imagine. So I read about one coach who, you usually have these interval drills. And in a workout, there'll be a set number. This morning I did an erg workout, and there were 8 intervals. Okay. And so the coach said, okay, our today's workout is the usual 10. And so, the rowers did the 10, and then we're kind of getting ready to row back. And the coach said, actually, today we're going to do 14. And the rowers all just groaned and said, no way, we're dead. Guess what? They did 4 more. They found that they had that capacity. They wouldn't have known that if they didn't have a coach that was a demanding coach. Well, the Stoic gods are that way. By the way, if they pick you out for testing, you're a lucky person, because if they thought you were hopeless, they wouldn't even bother with the test. But what they're going to do is they're going to plumb your depths and find the stuff that's there, the courage that's there, the strength that's there, that you don't know is there, but you can find out by being tested. And once you know it's there, it's a wonderful gift for you to have, because then when life presents you with a serious setback, you're going to rise to the challenge. You're going to show those Stoic gods who's in charge here, right? That they can't fool you with this. Same way as if you had a good coach, you want to sort of rise to the challenge, and it's a good thing if you do.
It's an almost religious way to view it, in as much as it provides meaning to suffering. It ameliorates your suffering through meaning, and there's a purpose behind this. It's not completely nihilistic. It's not completely just suffering for suffering's sake. It's a way to actively improve.
Let me pause you. Let me pause you there. It is a psychological device. So I don't actually believe there are Stoic gods. If you went to Mount Olympus, you couldn't find them and complain, about your rowing and what they were doing. It's a psychological device, and a highly effective psychological device, though. And actually, I will find myself talking to these imaginary Stoic gods, saying, Well, that was an interesting challenge, but you can do better than that, don't you think? And they have not yet spoken back to me. I think if they ever do talk back, then I need to see some kind of a therapist or something. But it is a game. It's a psychological game. And one other thing is Stoicism itself is not a religion. It's compatible with any number of religions, but it is not itself a religion. So you don't have to abandon whatever God you believe in to worship the Stoic gods instead, because they're a psychological mind game that you can play.
And you don't have to take on any dogmatic beliefs about it either. It's just accessible to anyone. You start off the book with a story about being in an airport, and I was reading this chuckling to myself because I failed a very similar Stoic test in was it a month or two before reading this book, where I encountered a setback at an airport and I got very frustrated and angry, and I got kind of emotional about it. And I view myself as quite a stoic person. So I was watching myself, kind of surprised that I was falling into this trap. And firstly, I realized, looking around, it's a very, actually, when I had an opportunity to sit back, I looked around and I thought, it's a very rare thing to do, to think stoically. It must be a tiny percentage of the population that think like that. But then I was also thinking how it's almost socially acceptable and socially normalized to have an emotional reaction to these things. It's expected from society. And if you're not doing that, you're the outlier. So it requires almost a kind of courage to step back from that and not join in with the masses of hysteria.
Yeah, I mean, most people, how do they decide what to do in life? They look around at what other people are doing and say, you know, they must have done their homework on this.
Yeah.
They must have done it and figured out this is the best way to do it. But that's not the case. Most people have not given careful thought to these issues, to this notion of setbacks. They have not read the ancient wisdom and said, you know what, I'm on a hedonic treadmill. I'm working really hard to get something. And as soon as I get it, I lose interest in it and I need something else. They've not done that. So it would be like a school class in which everybody was cheating off of everybody else's homework, but nobody had actually done the homework. So be an outlier. By all means, be an outlier. Think for yourself. Think it through. And then here's the biggest incentive. Look at these people. Are they happy? Are they well-adjusted, happy, satisfied individuals who are appreciative of the life they're living? And if they aren't, and you follow their advice, you're going to end up like they are. So there is another path, fortunately, that they can take.
The other side, as well as following the masses, is following emotion too, and having every decision guided by emotion. And I think that the separation between an objective experience and your subjective experience is a very important thing to do. Obviously, emotions play a role, though. We evolved to encounter emotion, and it's a kind of, it must have been there for a reason. If it didn't provide a benefit to us, why would we experience emotion through evolution? How much do you know how to listen to your emotion in let's say, a setback?
So Stoics were not unemotional. They were opposed to negative emotions like anger, like envy, like grief, like regret. The negative emotions. What makes them negative? They feel bad, right? Mm-hmm. So they were basically saying, you know what? There are these emotions that feel bad. Let's come up with a strategy to avoid those to the extent possible. They were all they're very much in favor of positive emotions, feelings of delight, feelings of appreciation, feelings of joy. And so they said, and besides avoiding the negative emotions, let's see if there's anything we can do to increase the number of positive emotions we experience. The Stoics also said there are times when, because of the way you're wired by evolution, there will be negative emotions that you just can't help avoiding. If you hear suddenly about the death of someone, for you to experience regret, that's natural. So Seneca said that means you're human. Good for you, you're a human. But then he counseled, okay, but keep it within bounds. So in one of his letters, he gives advice to a woman who 3 years after the death of her child was still in a state of mourning. And he said, okay, think of it this way. Would your child want you to still be in mourning 3 years after your death? And if he wouldn't want that, you're not helping him by being that way. So this kind of rational approach to it. Another interesting bit of advice Seneca offers is, he said, anger is a really bad. He wrote one of his longer essays is on anger and just the harm it causes people. And he said, really interesting strategy, but this tells you what kind of psychologists there were. He said, when you're dealing with a human being who is truly wooden-headed and they screw something up, it's okay to look angry. You shouldn't actually allow yourself to be angry, but to act as if you are angry, because that'll get through to them, which sounds manipulative, but sometimes life, that's the kindest way to go, is through manipulation. So they weren't unemotional, but they favored the positive emotions. And they were, in their time, were known as a cheerful bunch of people, which you wouldn't expect. Normally you think the Stoics are going to be grim, but the people who knew them regarded them as cheerful.
So so negative emotions have utility until a point. They are good. They serve a purpose to, I don't know, to provide meaning, or to show you a direction to head in, something like that, to show you what's good and to show you what's bad, essentially. But then once they've gone, you move on.
Another way to put it is, we evolved on the savannas of Africa, a radically different environment than we're in now. So we evolved to get hungry on a routine basis, in which food was always short. I guess there would have been times of abundance, but the lesson was, if food's there, eat it, because you don't know what tomorrow's going to hold. And we kept that wiring. And now today, food is abundant. So it's not a starvation problem anymore, at least not in the first world economies. It's obesity that's the problem. So we're wired to experience emotions in a way that used to help our ancestors survive and reproduce. And we're in a radically different environment. You see this coming through with social media, an interesting thing. So we evolved to care very much about, number one, to be part of a tribe, and number two, to care very much about our status within that tribe. Because if you were a loner on the savannas of Africa, you were dead before very long. But unfortunately now you have people who are obsessed with their status on, the social media. And the problem is that they're seeking the approval of people they don't even know. And it could be people who have radically different values than they do. And you're letting them decide what you do with your life. And that's a really dangerous thing to do.
Okay. So we've got to remember that we are in a different environment than the one that we evolved for.
Yes, a radically different environment. I mean, just think of the food we have, the health. We have a comfortable environment. So if we had it to do over again, who knows, 200,000 years from now. But of course, maybe we'll be ready. But if you imagine how technology will have changed by then, no, we still will be behind the curve.
And I suppose the same applies for in a physical event, in an athletic event. That's very different from the athletic event that you were primed for, which was escaping danger or chasing something down over days and days and days. Like sculling is a very different experience to that. And therefore you're going to have slightly non-serving emotional responses within that.
Yeah. The whole notion of fight and flight, anger you can actually make anger work for you. So the Stoics, for instance, if you're dealt with a setback, then you can you direct your anger sort of toward the Stoic gods, like, I'm going to show you.
Mm.
But if you get angry, I mean, there would be, I'm trying to even imagine, martial arts, and I don't know it well enough to know whether getting angry is a plus or a minus there. Could be a minus. I mean, something like jujitsu, where it's a very rational, you're problem solving, you're thinking your way through. If you get angry, anger inhibits in a major way your problem solving ability. Boxing, I don't know boxing well enough, but yeah, anger is bad. And if you look at all of the human beings whose lives have been ended as a result of anger, all the stupid wars started because of anger. But it served its place, because if you were in a tribe and somebody disrespected you and you let them get away with it, ooh, you lost status, meaning a less chance of mating, meaning you're going to be eating less, you're going to be eating later, and probably less. So for you to fight back, to be angry, was effective. It just now is counterproductive.
It's interesting you brought up the example of jiu-jitsu. I did jiu-jitsu for 2.5 years and I got all right at it. I got my blue belt. I was doing kind of okay.
Oh, really? I'm impressed.
So I was doing a little bit here and there, but that mistake of getting angry was always like, it was a trap that you could fall into very easily, because someone gets a couple of points on you and then you go for an aggressive movement, you extend your arm, and suddenly someone's trying to snap your arm in half. And it's like, oh, okay, that all came from anger. And even when you watch, for example, UFC or mixed martial arts, you see the pre-match press conferences or pre-fight press conferences, and you can tell it's a show. The anger is a show, and you get in the octagon, and then it's the anger's not there. It's calm, it's focused, it's present on what do I have to do right now, and relying on the training.
No, there's all this psychological stuff. I remember being at a regatta before a race, and this other competitor, I was talking to him, and he said, oh man, he really thought he wasn't going to do well that day, because he had flu the week before and he was feeling so weak now, and he rode very well. So, you try to get under people's skins, you try to get inside their head. But that's why you got to keep in mind, you can control you, and that's what you should focus on. So if I'm going to give a talk before a large audience, for instance, it's interesting. I used to be anxious. Now I would describe it as focused, in the sense that I got my work cut out for me. I got a game plan. I've done what I can do to prepare for this, and that's what I got, and that's what I'm gonna deliver. And in sports too, it's the same thing. I know I am at my most nervous when I'm pushing off from the dock to row to the starting line. And once I get out on the water and once I row, it's like the butterflies escape. They float off into space. I think it's very important that the butterflies were there. And I think it's very important that the butterflies subsequently leave me, because then I can focus on what I've got to do.
Well, I suppose it's embracing reality. Like there's no reality that exists without those butterflies. You might as well deal with that and be there with it rather than wishing they weren't there.
Yeah.
I think the challenge with any kind of change to the way you're thinking is this progression through, we call it the 4 C's of moving through the kind of adaptation, which is unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you're doing wrong, but you're doing it wrong. To conscious incompetence, it's like, okay, now I can observe myself doing wrong. To conscious competence, where I'm really having to work hard and really having to focus on making the right decisions in every moment, and every kind of option is different. And this is usually where people fall off, because it actually increases in resistance as you get through that. You think you're through it and you're not. And then finally into unconscious competence. How do you keep the Stoic challenge at top of mind when you're going throughout life?
Number one, I backslide routinely. So this morning, the rowing workout I did was had a coach, very, very good coach. And, he partway into it during our rest interval, he said, here's what you need to do differently. And he was right. And so the next interval I did that right. And then something else stopped working. It's sort of like there's just so much to keep track of. And the thing you're focusing your attention on is going to work. And then the other stuff falls away. It's practice of Stoicism, same thing. So I do have moments when I find myself getting angry. And the interesting thing is when you get far enough into the practice of Stoicism, then it's possible to get angry on two different levels. Number one, you're just angry in the normal sense. Number two, you're angry that you're angry. I shouldn't be this way, and yet I am this way. And so you're upset about being upset. And then at that point, you throw your hands up and say, okay, let's just not be angry. Let's just move on from there. That whole notion of watching yourself do something. So we were talking before about lazy Bill. One of the interesting things, so to do a sport is to do self-therapy, because you get to do something. So when you're in the middle of a race and your dog tired, then you bring out all of these inner voices that normally hide out in a back bedroom. But when you're trying to do something very difficult and your brain is oxygen starved and you got a bunch of things going on, they come creeping out, and they're the weakest part of you, but you've got them before you. You've got a front row seat to watch them at work. And they're gonna just make all sorts of suggestions. You'd feel better if you just slowed down. Oh, what would feel really good is to quit. Just quit rowing at this point. And then it's a chance, because then you do full contact martial arts with these forces. You punch them back into their hiding holes, and you experience a triumph in the process of doing that. And I know from experience that you let them have their way with you once, and they are going to be riding high for weeks after that. So you just can't quit. And yet, being a human, sometimes that happens. So when thrown, you must resaddle as quickly as you can.
That's lovely. There's something about personifying those forces that come against you and seeing them as mini personalities that come out. It's like, okay, this is a small individual, and kind of doing battle with them that is so empowering with it. Yeah. It's like, this is the way I'm focusing on it. Like, I'm attacking this and doing battle with this. It's such a useful way to think.
Yeah, I call mine, you mentioned this before, I call mine Lazy Bill. And again, he hangs out in the back bedroom. I think he plays video games or something like that. And then occasionally when I'm trying to do something difficult, he will come out and make suggestions about, I don't have to work this hard. I'm sure that everybody has their own personal equivalent of a lazy Bill lurking in them. It's just that in some cases, a lazy Bill has taken control of the place. Lazy Bill is now in charge. So they don't think in terms of, I wonder what my lazy Bill would say if it came out, because that's all they got Lazy Bill. And that's a shame. They have only one life to live, and to live it with Lazy Bill in charge. That's bad news. So here's just a challenge for your listeners. Think about something that would be difficult for you to do, and do it. How come? Because it's going to be difficult for you to do. And in the process of doing that, you're going to learn a lot about yourself if you're paying attention. But what if you fail? Oh, that's wonderful, because then you will see that it's possible to fail and bounce back from failing. And oh, by the way, here's some advice for you. I can tell you a surefire way never, ever to fail again in life. And that is, don't ever do something difficult. Just get on that couch, relax, have some chips, right? Watch some television, and you will never have to experience failure. And you'll also never grow as a human being. You'll never flourish. You'll never gain the self-confidence that can serve you very well in life. So the other thing is, if you look at people who are successful, and you track their life experience, you'll find that most of them failed multiple times. It's just that when they fail, they don't sort of say, well, I failed, so I got to quit. They say, I failed. What can I learn from that failure? What can I change to go on to make new, better failures? And of course, almost everybody, if you can walk, you have shown your ability to withstand failure. I was reading these numbers the other day on a part of a research project, so I'm not going to get them exactly right, but it's something like this. The average 1-year-old falls down, it's like 80 times a day. And what does he do? He gets back up, tries it again. That's a wonderful approach to life. I fell. Well, I should try again. Whereas by the time you're an adult, the fear of even falling once is, it just locks your life. You can't develop beyond that.
Someone calculated how many times you have to fall in order to win a gold medal at ice skating in the Olympics, and it's 1 million plus.
Oh, okay. I believe that. I believe that. But then think of how many people would do it, fall once and say, that's it. And then they can never go on. Even if you don't have your goal, have it as your goal to win the Olympics or to win, to be at a national level of competition. To go out and attempt to learn a sport and attempt to do a sport can be a really important life lesson. So even if you're going to learn about the sport, and that's interesting. So in the pandemic, my wife and I got bicycles and started doing lots of cycling. And then it's just amazing the things we see that we wouldn't have seen before. We'll be passing a car and we'll say, oh, look at that trailer hitch, things like that. But it spills over into the rest of your life. Even doing it at a low grade way, you'll sort of discover things about sports, discover things about the world, discover things about people and the way people relate, and most significantly, discover things about yourself.
Yeah, that's a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much for your time. There's one piece of language I thought is one of the best ways to frame things that was from the Stoic Challenge that's been playing around my mind since I read it, which is my goal is to acquire metal, not medals. And that's such a useful phrase for me, in whether it's in work, whether it's in difficult conversations with people that I love, conversations with people that I don't love, whether it's training, everything. So that's been incredibly beneficial for me. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank the Stoics. I'm just the messenger.
Absolutely will do then. I'll thank those Stoic gods. Thank you very much for your time, Bill.
Oh, thank you for the invitation.
Where can people find out a bit more about your books, about yourself, like catch up with, where would you recommend people start with your work?
So I'm not big on social media, but you can go to William B, that's B as in boy, Irvine, williambirvine.com. And there's more there. There's stuff to read. There's stuff to listen to, more there than any sensible human needs of William B. Irvine.